War. War never changes.
You some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 112, Simon Bolivar and the Liberator's Art of War. It was foolish for me to attempt to dip my toes into Latin America without first introducing the architect of its martial spirit and pan-national identity. How can I talk of Panama without first talking of Gran Colombia, and itself without talking about the man who rightfully can be called its father? More so, Bolivar is a military commander on par with a Napoleon or Caesar or Frederick the Great. His political acumen, perhaps not quite as much. But to understand warfare in Latin America, you have to understand Bolivar, his background, his campaigns, his fighting style, and his philosophy. But real quick, we are bombing Iran again. Here's where the Iranians are showing a lack of understanding. The Iran political modus operandi was the aforementioned humiliation ritual. Get something they want, and they humiliate the grantor of said concession. They did it in 1979 by seizing the U.S. Embassy after Carter abandoned the Shah. They did it in 1996, as we discussed earlier, and they are doing it now. But Trump is not a Carter or a Clinton, and his ego is not something the Iranians have encountered before with otherwise tepid American presidents. Trump won't be humiliated without action. So I think the Iranians have stepped on their crank. I don't know if they understand this, nor do I think they could change if they acknowledge this simple reality. The center of gravity for this fight, from the political to the operational level, remains the Strait of Hormuz. Either we open it or we don't. I believe we can, with some deft diplomatic efforts as well as brute military strengths. If we can't, it remains an indictment on the entire U.S. military, our NATO alliance, and specifically the U.S. Navy. I tragically think the War Department lacks the decisive and intelligent senior leaders in uniform to achieve our national policy objectives, but we will see. And I have been remiss in not thanking, publicly, my subscribers who pay the bills for this show. Dave, Paul, Ken, Brian, Dennis, George, Christopher, Austin, and of course, Squeezy. Steve and Tim are new additions, and thank you very much for your contributions. To all of you, my thanks again. I will also note that I have expanded my podcasting into being a guest on shows. If you have any interest in me talking in the standard interview type format, you can check out my audio-only appearance on the 11 Bang Gang podcast. I ask that you listen carefully to how I just said that and type it into your device accurately. I was also on the Raising Men podcast by Sean Dawson. That will be upcoming in the next week or so. There will be more podcasts coming up in the weeks where I talk about War 102 and its specific subjects, as well as some more personal areas. So with that, let's get to the point. Few military leaders have shaped the political geography of an entire continent as profoundly as Simon Bolivar. Remembered as El Liberador, the Liberator, Bolivar was not merely a charismatic revolutionary, but a commander who developed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of strategy, operational maneuver, logistics, and political warfare over nearly 2 decades of continuous campaigning. Unlike many celebrated generals who inherited disciplined armies and established institutions, Bolivar began with fragmented militias, almost no resources, and a coalition of competing regional interests. His greatest military achievement was therefore not simply defeating Spanish armies in battle, but transforming revolutionary movements into effective military organizations, capable of sustaining prolonged campaigns across some of the most challenging terrain in the world. I did that in my favorite Top Gear voice. In the world. Bolivar's military thought evolved through experience rather than formal military education. Throughout his career, he developed a remarkable willingness to adapt his methods after defeat, abandoning conventional approaches when circumstances demanded innovation. These campaigns ultimately liberated Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and they were built upon lessons learned during repeated failures. Understanding these formative years is therefore essential to understanding the strategic principles that later defined his success. Simon Bolivar was born in Caracas on July 24, 1783, into one of Venezuela's wealthiest Creole families. Understand, Creole in this meaning is a European descendant born in the Americas. So his upbringing provided access to an education uncommon in colonial Spanish America. Although orphaned at a young age, he continued to receive instruction from several influential tutors, most notably Simon Rodriguez, whose Enlightenment ideals profoundly shaped Bolivar's political philosophy. Rodriguez encouraged independent thought and introduced his pupil to the writings of Montesquieu, Rousseau, Locke, and Voltaire. These intellectual influences would later inform Bolivar's understanding of republican government, national sovereignty, and military leadership. Like many educated elites of his generation, Bolivar admired the examples of the Roman Republic and the careers of Alexander and Julius Caesar. He also closely followed the campaigns of Napoleon Bonaparte, whose rapid operational movements and decisive concentration of force demonstrated military intervention. Bolivar's travels through Europe between 1799 and 1807 further expanded his horizons. He witnessed Napoleon's coronation as Emperor of the French, an event that left a lasting impression. Although Bolivar admired Napoleon's military genius, he later criticized what he viewed as Napoleon's abandonment of republic ideals in favor of personal dictatorship. This distinction would remain central throughout Bolivar's own career. He sought military victory not as an end in itself, but as a means of establishing independent republican governments. The political crisis that transformed Bolivar from aristocrat to revolutionary emerged in 1808, when Napoleon invaded Spain and deposed King Ferdinand VII. Across Spanish America, local elites questioned whether colonial governments retained legitimacy in the absence of the monarch. Shades of Hobbes and his Leviathan are certainly showing here. In Caracas, revolutionary leaders established a governing junta in April of 1810. Bolivar quickly emerged as one of its strongest advocates for complete independence rather than continued loyalty to a captive king. Initially, however, military considerations remained secondary. The revolutionary movement assumed that independence could be achieved through political negotiation and limited military resistance rather than prolonged warfare. This assumption proved optimistic and fatally so. He really needed a branch plan. The First Venezuelan Republic declared independence in July of 1811, but possessed few characteristics necessary for military success. Its armed forces consisted of poorly trained militia with no centralized command, no real equipment, no logistical support. Political divisions among revolutionary leaders further complicated military planning. Many commanders possessed little combat experience and underestimated the determination of Spanish loyalists, many of whom were combat veterans from the Peninsula campaign against Napoleon. Bolivar himself initially served as a relatively junior officer, his early responsibilities including defending positions and maintaining internal security, rather than directing any sort of campaigns. But these assignments exposed him to the practical difficulties of revolutionary warfare. One of the first strategic lessons Bolivar learned concerning the relationship between military power and political legitimacy. Revolutionary governments could proclaim independence, but unless they possessed military forces capable of defending territory, these declarations remained vulnerable. Control of cities alone proved insufficient if surrounding rural regions remained loyal to the Spanish crown. The collapse of the First Republic in 1812 resulted from multiple interacting factors. A devastating earthquake struck Venezuela in March, causing widespread destruction. Sound familiar? Royalist clergy interpreted the disaster as divine punishment for the rebellion, strengthening support for the crown among many rural populations. And more significant from a military perspective, Spanish forces successfully exploited revolutionary weaknesses. Rather than seeking immediate decisive engagement, Royalist commanders concentrated on isolating Republican garrisons, disrupting communications, and encouraging defections. You'll note that this is an inverse of normal counterinsurgency doctrine. It's the Spanish loyalist forces who are waging the insurgent campaign against what was obviously a fairly popular, though city-based, republic being formed. The insurgents against the crown held the cities, and the royalists held the rural areas. So the decisive moment came when General Francisco de Miranda, commander of Republican forces, concluded that continued resistance was impossible. He negotiated a surrender with Spanish authorities. Bolivar regarded the capitulation as both a military and political catastrophe. He believed Miranda had surrendered prematurely and failed to exploit remaining opportunities for continued resistance. And this experience profoundly influenced Bolivar's later command philosophy. In subsequent campaigns, he consistently emphasized persistence, mobility, and the refusal to concede defeat, despite temporary setbacks. After escaping capture, Bolivar traveled to Cartagena in New Granada, where he composed one of the most important early political documents, commonly known as the Cartagena Manifesto. Although written primarily as a military analysis, the document also revealed Bolivar's emerging understanding of military strategy. He argued that the First Republic had failed because it dispersed authority, neglected military preparation, tolerated political factionalism, and underestimated loyalist resistance. Effective revolutionary government, he concluded, required centralized political leadership capable of directing military operations decisively. This emphasis upon unity of command became one of the defining characteristics of Bolivar's later campaigns and is obviously one of our principles of war. In 1813, Bolivar launched what became known as the Admirable Campaign. Supported by revolutionary authorities in New Granada, he assembled a relatively small expeditionary force and advanced into western Venezuela. The campaign demonstrated Bolivar's growing appreciation for operational mobility. Rather than attempting to occupy every town along the route, he concentrated upon maintaining momentum. Rapid marches prevented Spanish commanders from coordinating their scattered garrisons. By forcing repeated withdrawals, Bolivar achieved strategic effects disproportionate to the size of his army. Speed became one of Bolivar's greatest military advantages, and he recognized that revolutionary armies generally lacked the manpower and resources necessary for prolonged sieges or attritional warfare. Instead, they had to exploit temporary local superiority through rapid concentration of force against isolated enemy detachments. Bolivar also demonstrated an increasingly sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare, or PSYOPs. His proclamations were designed not merely to inspire supporters, but to influence neutral populations and discourage loyalist resistance. Every military advance became simultaneously a political campaign aimed at expanding revolutionary legitimacy. During the Admirable Campaign, Bolivar liberated several major cities, culminating in his triumphant entry into Caracas. The Second Venezuelan Republic was established, and Bolivar received the title El Libertador, or the Liberator, which would remain associated with him through history. Yet beneath these successes lay persistent strategic weakness. Spanish authority in Venezuela depended less upon regular European troops than upon locally recruited royalist militias. These forces possessed the knowledge of local terrain and enjoyed stronger support among rural populations than Republican armies drawn largely from urban elites. And most importantly, Bolivar had not yet solved the challenge of integrating the llaneros, the cattlemen of Venezuela's vast plains, into the revolutionary cause. The llanos represented one of South America's most distinctive military environments. Vast grasslands extending across central Venezuela favored highly mobile cavalry rather than conventional infantry operations. The llaneros were expert horsemen capable of extraordinary endurance under the most difficult conditions. Their knowledge of rivers, seasonal flooding, and open terrain gave them enormous tactical advantage. Initially, many llaneros supported the royalists rather than the republicans. They viewed the largely aristocratic revolutionary leadership with suspicion and often identified more closely with local commanders and distant political ideals. And Spanish leaders skillfully exploited these loyalties. The emergence of José Tomás Boves dramatically transformed the conflict. Boves, an exceptionally capable royalist cavalry commander, recruited thousands of llaneros by appealing to social grievances as well as loyalty to the crown. His mounted forces repeatedly overwhelmed Republican armies through aggressive offensive operations. Unlike conventional European commanders, Boves understood irregular warfare perfectly suited to Venezuelan conditions. His cavalry moved with remarkable speed, avoided the predictable lines of advance, and struck unexpectedly before disappearing into the plains, and Bolivar struggled to counter these tactics. His own forces remained heavily dependent upon infantry organized according to European models. Although effective in defending urban populations, infantry formations proved vulnerable against highly mobile cavalry operating across open country. Repeated engagements during 1814 exposed this imbalance. Bolivar found himself fighting an enemy who often refused decisive battles on conventional terms, and instead royalist cavalry targeted supply lines, isolated detachments, and vulnerable garrisons. Tactical victories achieved by Republican forces failed to produce any strategic results because surviving royalist units simply withdrew and reassembled elsewhere. These experiences reinforced Bolivar's appreciation for mobility and logistics. He increasingly recognized that campaigns depended less upon occupying territory than upon sustaining operational momentum. Armies incapable of maintaining supplies, recruiting replacements, or preserving cavalry mobility would eventually lose the strategic initiative. Bolivar also confronted the immense geographic challenges of northern South America. Rivers, mountain, jungles, and vast plains divided military operations into distinct theaters, each requiring very different tactical approaches. European drill manuals offered limited guidance for campaigning across flooded savannas, tropical forests, or high mountain passes. Successful commanders therefore had to adapt So Bolivar began emphasizing decentralized operations in which subordinate commanders enjoyed greater freedom of action while pursuing a broader strategic objective. Although this approach occasionally produced coordination problems, it reflected the practical necessity of decentralized command and control rather than doctrinal preference. The collapse of the Second Republic forced Bolivar again into exile. From a purely military perspective, these defeats might appear to demonstrate failure, but they instead provided the basis of Bolivar's military education. Between 1810 and 1815, he had learned several enduring strategic principles that would later define his greatest victories. First, revolutionary armies could not rely upon static defense. Mobility offered their greatest comparative advantage. Second, military success required political legitimacy. Third, cavalry represented the decisive arm in much of northern South America. Any revolutionary strategy that failed to secure the support of the llaneros would remain fatally incomplete. Fourth, logistics, and not battlefield heroics, almost always determined campaign success. And finally, unity of command proved indispensable. The fragmented political authority inevitably weakened military effectiveness. While you can delegate military operations to the man on the ground, you cannot delegate the political authority and having that unity of command at the highest levels. By the end of 1815, he remained without a country, without an army, and without secure political authority. Many contemporaries believe the revolutionary cause had been irretrievably defeated, yet Bolivar viewed the situation differently. His defeats had revealed the weakness of earlier methods while illuminating new possibilities. In exile, he would begin reshaping both his political vision and his new military strategy. And that's it for the first installment. Next week, we'll hit it again as Simon strikes back.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.